Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. You'll hear from my colleagues Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso right here on this episode in just a moment. The bye week is in the rearview mirror for the Nittany Lions. They move forward to face UMass. Homecoming matchup, 3:30 kickoff time in Beaver Stadium this Saturday. And then it's Big Ten football the rest of the way. The rest of the way here, 7 Saturdays. Actually, one Friday in that mix, Black Friday in Detroit, but 6 other Saturdays. And then by then, we'll figure out if Penn State punches their ticket to Indianapolis, the Big Ten title matchup that first weekend of December. But what we have in front of us is a 7-week stretch, 7 matchups for a 5-0 squad. Let's dive into it with Daniel Gallen right now. Daniel, you and I back in Beaver Stadium, James Franklin's weekly press conference. He took the week off from that setting last week, back in familiar territory now. And as I just said, we're kind of locked in for the rest of the way to see how this thing unfolds.
Yeah, we're done with the bye week. It's mid-October now. I had to turn the heat on this morning. It's that type of year, or that time of year. And even if you don't really get excited for UMass on Saturday, you only get 12 chances, or you're only guaranteed 12 chances to watch Penn State. So it's good to be back out there. I'm looking forward to this weekend, and maybe later this month, some a little bit bigger games that we can talk about.
Yeah, I mentioned before when Penn State was able to get to the bye week with that win over Northwestern, ended up being a 41-13 victory. And then coming out of it against UMass, it buys you some time to let chaos unfold a little bit across Power 5 football. Let some of these supposed contenders maybe fall by the wayside. Let some of those surprising, stinging losses happen to some teams while you sitting around, enjoying that 0 in the loss column. And Daniel, that happened a bit on Saturday. There was some chaos. We saw Notre Dame pick up a second loss. They got smoked by Louisville in that second half. Of course, we saw a top 10 team go down in the Texas Longhorns, losing to Oklahoma, who jumped up big and actually jumped past Penn State in the Associated Press poll. But when it all kind of settled, you write our story on Sunday about the national rankings. Where's Penn State right now from a national perspective through about a month and, I guess 5 weeks of the season, 6 weeks of the season?
Yeah, Penn State held steady in that AP poll, number 6. And it's been, in both polls, the progress has been incremental. Starting at number 7 in the preseason, then inching up, now to number 6 in the AP. They got up to number 5 in the coaches poll. Texas was ahead of both of them in both polls, and the Longhorns lost that thriller to the Sooners. Definitely one of the better finishes I think I've seen this year. And that knocked Texas out of the top 5. In the coaches poll, Penn State was rewarded by moving up to number 5. In the AP poll, Oklahoma got the reward to jump up above Penn State. And so, with these, the polls, I know that we're almost getting to the season where it's going to be, I think, every Tuesday night with that college football, the college football playoff rankings coming out. And those are the ones that really, really matter. But I do think that looking at this every single week is a good way to gather some data on the team, how it's being perceived nationally. The poll trackers for the AP poll, you can see where the range is and everything like that. But it seems like that Penn State is really firmly in that conversation as being seen among the few contenders, for those top 4 spots at this point in the season. So it's always nice to pick up move up a spot or, something like that when you're not even playing a game. But it's getting close to where it's going to be time to take care of business for Penn State.
Daniel picked the wrong season to go to the Red River Showdown during Penn State's bye week. He went with it last week and saw a 49-0 Texas Longhorns win down in Dallas. This time around, as you said, one of the games of the year thus far in terms of how that one finished, and we'll see how that shakes up. And you're starting to, when you're unbeaten and the deeper you get, and then if you pick up a loss even, you're just always starting to check the scoreboard more and more week by week. Who's picking up a second loss, who's avoiding the upsets, and just quickly to go through the top 10 in the AP top 25, which I would say is the rankings that are held in the highest esteem, the one you're going to see on the TV broadcast until we get the college football playoff rankings a little bit later. Number 1, Georgia, the 2-time defending champion. Number 2, Michigan, the 2-time defending Big Ten champion. Number 3, Ohio State. Number 4, Florida State. Number 5, Oklahoma after that win against Texas. 6, Penn State. 7, Washington, incoming to the Big Ten. 8, Oregon, incoming to the Big Ten. Texas, and 10 USC incoming to the Big Ten. So 6 of the current top 10 nationally will be residing inside of this conference come 2024. There's a lot to get into from a conference standpoint, and we'll do that in just a bit about where the Big Ten is heading, some James Franklin's thoughts on non-conference scheduling and what you're trying to really angle for in the modern college football era. But let's start with what we heard from James on some injury updates, because that's really what we're looking at here coming out of the bye week. What do they do to remedy some bumps and bruises? From a health standpoint, in pretty good shape. You were in better shape before the Northwestern game, but we saw Katron Allen on the field last week, as we said. We saw Harrison Wallace on the field, and I think it continues to sound positive, Daniel, from what we're hearing from James Franklin regarding Trey Wallace, Harrison Wallace III. Last week at practice, James referenced that he seemed like he was ready to come back full strength, and then he had a bit of a tweak leading up to the Northwestern matchup. We didn't see him against Northwestern. We saw him a bit the week prior against Iowa, and we didn't see him at all against Illinois in week 3. And so you got to go back to game 2, which was September 9th, the last time we really saw Harrison Wallace in being who he can be at wide receiver. 10 catches through those first couple games. And something that stuck out to me is he called him a big piece of the puzzle when he was asked specifically about this passing attack, really the wide receiver dynamics moving forward, because there's a lot of questions about what Penn State can put together here for the final 7 regular season games. And he almost immediately said, well, Harrison Wallace, he's got Trey, is a big piece of that puzzle. He said when he comes back and when he is himself, that's good news for Drew Aller. That's good news for Keandre Lambert-Smith. And he said that's good news for Mike Yurcich. So I think it's very clear based on what we heard throughout preseason camp, what we continue to hear from James Franklin, that it remains a Keandre Lambert-Smith, Harrison Wallace, and everyone else situation at wide receiver. The caveat being when Harrison Wallace is available. When he has not been available, it has definitively been Keandre Lambert-Smith, then some tight ends, then maybe Nick Singleton, and then maybe some wide receivers. It's been very tough to figure out what that passing game looks like. But it sure sounds like things are rolling in the right direction with the redshirt sophomore receiver.
Man, so September 9th feels like a long time ago at this point. The last time we really saw Trey Wallace out there. But, I think that you look at some of the issues that Penn State had in the passing game against Northwestern, that felt like the timing might have been a little bit off on some things. It seemed like there are a couple points where wide receivers weren't where Drew Aller thought they were going to be. In terms of where he was going with the ball. And I think through the first 2 games, you saw great chemistry between Trey Wallace and Drew Aller. I mean, I thought Trey Wallace was really, really good in that West Virginia game. Keandre Lambert-Smith had the big touchdown, but Trey Wallace was the one who was catching the ball over the middle, moving the chains, keeping the offense on schedule. I don't think that's something you can underrate when it comes to an offense, especially one like Penn State right now that, it is kind of choppy, going through the air. It hasn't necessarily been, I think, what we thought it might be in terms of Drew Aller and where his potential is in terms of a big time aerial attack. But I think getting Trey Wallace back and healthy, most importantly, can do a lot for this offense. Just giving Drew Aller a target that he can trust, that he can go to, and I'll just keep this team on schedule. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing. That's what they want to do. They want to keep the ball moving. They don't want to turn the ball over. They want to be efficient. And I think Trey Wallace really helps you do that. And maybe you start to see some of the explosive traits that we've heard so much about, and kind of maybe the type of player we thought he might be based on that basketball background, based on his speed, based on everything else we've heard.
Yeah, and I think with Harrison Wallace, you mentioned that the explosive traits, the jump out the basketball gym kind of stuff that we'd love to see in some one-on-one settings down the field, 30 yards in the air. And we saw a little bit of those moments. He had a bright spot on the road against Michigan last year, one of his early flashes. And then in the Utah game, he had a couple big pickups. And you think of that, but then you look at the stat sheet from those first couple of games, and I remember saying, hey, don't judge Harrison Wallace by the stat line of 10 catches for 98 yards. But there's something to be said for that safety net kind of presence for Drew Aller. And I don't think that we truly had our heads wrapped around through the first 120 minutes of football what this offensive strategy was going to look like, where you're relying so much on the short to intermediate passing game. And with Harrison Wallace, I mean, he is as proven a commodity as anyone outside of Keandre Lambert-Smith in terms of at this level of football. And so I think if they're getting him back, as it sounds like that's where things are heading, Wouldn't be surprised if he's in the starting lineup again on Saturday against UMass. And if he's not, getting a lot of run, if you can get some signs and indication this Saturday that he's got his feet back underneath him, he's on the same page with Drew Aller. You don't need him to go get 7-8 catches for 120 yards, but if you can see him move the chains a bit, get some considerable action in this offense before you imagine they're going to close up shop at some point in the third or fourth quarter if things go according to plan. I personally will feel more optimistic about Penn State going on the road to Columbus and what they're bringing in that wide receiver room versus another matchup where Harrison Wallace is a guy who goes through warmups, doesn't play or gets 20 reps late in the third or fourth quarter, and some of those are without Drew Aller. And if you can see him actually put together a complete performance where the staff clearly has confidence that he's ready to roll, I think that would go a long way because, as you said, September 9th, going further and further down the road, and you're getting some distance from the last time when Harrison Wallace was an impact performer for this offensive attack.
Yeah, I think that you need all the pieces that you can get going up against a team like Ohio State. We talked about some of the action from this past weekend. There was a team that had a little bit of trouble, still ended up winning comfortably and even covering what was a pretty big spread to begin with. But in the early going there, it was not the smoothest outing from the Buckeyes. We saw some wide receivers from Maryland make some great plays. I mean, I think that Caden Prather touchdown catch was one of the best catches I've seen this season. So, I think that you want to be at this point in the season, with as full of a deck as you possibly can have, especially when Drew Aller is your quarterback, who hasn't been in the position where he needs to win you a game yet. I think that we all think that that's coming sooner rather than later. And I think that most of us think it could happen as soon as next week in Columbus. And, if you're going to do that, if you're going to put it on Drew Aller's shoulders, you need Trey Wallace to be there, to be that guy that we saw against West Virginia, and maybe even that guy that we saw against Michigan for that one, I believe it was a 48-yard catch, and against Utah. So, I think that getting him back, James Franklin said that, overall team health is pretty good. It's never perfect because this is football. That's just how it works. But that things are, seem to be trending in a good direction with Harrison Wallace, and that can only mean a good thing for this offense.
James Franklin has been, kind of, I guess, a little bit more public in the way he's treating the Harrison Wallace situation than maybe we're accustomed to with some of the injury concerns, and specifically, more recently, JB Nelson. Nothing new of note there. He was asked specifically about Nelson's status, and James Franklin just said that there's no update in that regard. I think we'll have a little bit more for Lions247.com readers come Wednesday evening when we get off the practice field, and whether or not JB Nelson is active out there and participating. He was not last week, and after practice, as we talked about on the last podcast episode, we asked James Franklin about if that was a season-ending specific injury. James Franklin indicated it was not at that point. So we'll keep tabs on JB Nelson, who's been the starter at left guard. As we've covered a lot this season, Vega Ioane is essentially a starter for this team. He did start once in week 2, and he has played 40-plus snaps in 4 consecutive games now. So he would be the next man up at left guard. You're also kind of watching some other pieces on the offensive line, which we indicated on our practice report last week. A freshman like Anthony Donka, maybe he takes a step up the ladder a bit as a true freshman right now with 2 game appearances. But Daniel, nothing new to note there, so we don't want to go too much further. We'll just say check out our practice notes on Wednesday when it comes to what exactly is happening from an availability perspective, a little bit closer to kickoff. Some shared history with Don Brown, with James Franklin, not just going toe-to-toe here as Big Ten coaches, with Brown most recently being the defensive coordinator for several years under Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, but on the same staff with a current Big Ten team. They weren't in the Big Ten at that time, but a lot of mutual admiration here. And, when James Franklin spends the kind of time he did in a press conference setting going on about his history with the opposing head coach, I think it's very genuine. And Don Brown, now in year 2 with UMass, has not been very nearly as successful as where it was when they were at the FCS level and he was in charge of the program about 15 years ago or so. But right now, a lot of ground to make up for Don Brown, but James Franklin tipped his cap in his direction.
Yeah, Don Brown and James Franklin were the coordinators under Ralph Friedgen at Maryland. They were there at the end of Friedgen's tenure when Maryland won 9 games in the ACC in 2010. And Don Brown is just someone where I feel like that, even just the most tangential college football fan has probably heard something about him at some point, just because of the respect that he has and the way that he's looked at as the defensive mind that he is. I was a student in 2010 at Maryland when it was Brown and Franklin as the coordinators under Friedgen, and anytime you watch that Maryland defense, there was always something interesting going on. They had some fun players that Don Brown could use in unique ways. I know that he's very well regarded as a super aggressive type of defensive coordinator. But it was interesting to hear James Franklin talk about what he kind of learned, from Don Brown, even in kind of a more clerical fashion in terms of doing install, and how to go about it and what it was like to install an offense while going against a Don Brown defense, and how to prepare for different things and different looks. You brought it up. I mean, the success that Don Brown had at UMass and the FCS level is much different from where that program is now in terms of being in the FBS. But I think that James Franklin knows that he's someone that can do some unique things defensively. And we heard James Franklin kind of, I think, really gas up this UMass offense and this team. I think he said that he thinks this is the most explosive team that they've played this year, and he had stats to back it up. He said number 2 in plays of 50 plus yards nationally, number 9 in plays of 10 plus yards. So I think that even though it's UMass, even though we know what is coming up next week, that James Franklin is really working to make sure that this team has his team's attention and probably our attention too. And I think that part of it is the fact that he knows Don Brown so well. They have this history together. James Franklin kind of knows what he's going to see from him. And I think that that's something that can kind of maybe help things stay engaged a little bit more, because there is a personal connection there. There is that familiarity, and that's something that you can really drive home.
Caesar Sportsbook, as of Monday, had this betting line at Penn State favored by 42.5. So just over 6 touchdowns in this matchup. UMass on the season 1-6 thus far. They're an independent program. Last week losing to Toledo 41-24. They've played one Power 5 opponent this season. Went on the road to visit Auburn on September 2nd. Lost 59-14 that day to the Tigers, and thus far just 2 wins into second season now for Don Brown. I think he's 2-17 in the second stint with the Minutemen. So you wouldn't think Beaver Stadium on a Saturday afternoon is a spot to find your mojo for the Minutemen, but as you said, James Franklin specifically talking about that offense and some of the playmakers they have, and maybe some of the talent, Power 5 talent, really that they may be able to bring, maybe at a different level than what we've seen in some recent weeks. So, Daniel, with that in mind, we also heard a lot about the current defensive coordinator for Penn State, the guy that James Franklin's able to lean on in a lot of ways right now, and really let him be in so many ways that head coach of the defense. Because as James Franklin said, a lot of assistants have aspirations and ideas of what they would do as a head coach and why they think it would work and why it would, really help the program. And then there's guys who have experienced the head coach life, and they're just a different perspective that is a different value within your program if they approach it the right way. And I thought Josh Pate on our last episode of this podcast did a nice job of breaking down all the other options that Manny Diaz could have had instead of sinking his teeth into another defense and trying to lock in here at Penn State. And he has done that thus far. And James Franklin spent several minutes, Daniel, describing the detail and I guess the accountability that Manny Diaz brings to the leadership role, the game plan structure, and just managing all those defensive talents and egos on a weekly basis. We've heard it from the players. They're excited when they show up to work on Monday and Tuesday and they start to install things for the next week because they're not sure what Manny Diaz is going to have up his sleeve. And I think they've got some really exciting matchups coming in terms of things we haven't seen through 5 weeks. And Manny Diaz, if things go according to plan and he's able to push the right buttons over these next couple months, he may be one of the hottest names in the head coaching market, in my opinion. If he's not, then I'd be shocked.
Yeah, I didn't have the chance to go back and check the timestamps, but I think while James Franklin was talking, I checked my recorder, and I think he went on for, it was at least 4 minutes straight, just talking about Manny Diaz and everything that, he's brought to this team and what it's been like to work with him. I did think that Franklin touched on something that we hadn't really heard from him before in terms of Manny Diaz coming in to replace Brent Pry, and kind of the dynamics that were there in the room, because Brent Pry was someone that been here for a long time. He had recruited and, coached all of the guys on that side of the ball. In some cases for, a lot of years, when you talk about guys like someone like PJ Mustafer,
Yeah.
who was sticking around. And, I think that the fact that Manny Diaz was able to come into that room, into that situation, and really ingratiate himself, with this team. I think that that really speaks volumes to, the emotional intelligence and just the overall intelligence that he has as a football coach. I think that that's something that, could have gone in a different direction. And, you hear so much about from these Penn State players just about how entertaining it is, to play for Manny Diaz, and just how they're having fun. They feel like they're being put in the positions to really maximize their skill sets. And that's something that, really makes them want to be out there. They want to play for him. I think that this is winding up to just be a, super, super savvy hire by James Franklin at the time. I mean, I think that on the surface, it was, when you think about losing Brent Pry, and then, Manny Diaz gets forced out at Miami and you're able to snap him up right away. I mean, you talk about in this industry, what has to align, how things kind of have to line up in order, for things to break right, in terms of some personnel things. But, but I think just as time has gone on, the hire just looks better and better and better, especially when you really factor in what you're hearing from the players. So I think what's going to happen to Manny Diaz is really interesting. I know I was actually kind of surprised it didn't come up last week when we were talking to him. I think the furthest that we looked ahead was to Ohio State, which Manny Diaz didn't touch. But in the past, it's come up, and he's pretty standard boilerplate that you know that's in the future. He's focused on what he's doing right now. But I do think what he has said, and I think Franklin has brought it up, that being able to just be a defensive coordinator again, just be a linebackers coach, really focus on being the head coach of the defense as opposed to being a head coach and everything else that comes along with it. I think that that's something that, has really rejuvenated Manny Diaz. Helps when you're getting results. But I think everything else that we've heard and seen beyond these results, really points to someone who, there's going to be a lot of phone calls made, once we get to December. I think we're going to see his name a lot. What he decides to do, I think he's the only one that might know that. But it's going to be really interesting to follow. But in the meantime, I think Penn State fans should just really, really enjoy watching this defense, the collection of talent that they have, the way that they're being deployed. It's just been really fun to watch, and Manny Diaz has been a big part of that.
It's a monster move. I mean, thus far, a season and a half, this is the kind of move you see Nick Saban making, bringing in head coaches as coordinators for a year or two, and then sending them off on their way to the next chapter of their careers. I mean, if you can make a habit of this, that's a great thing. But the fact is, this defensive coordinator search was so pivotal because Brent Pry was that inner circle, figure for so long with James Franklin before they got to Happy Valley. And I mean, we had a hell of a defensive coordinator search message board thread on our site going through that entire thing. And when that started, Manny Diaz, I believe, was still the head coach for the Miami Hurricanes, and it weaved. And I mean, this was a Hall of Fame worthy thread, Daniel. I know you weren't here around then, but it ultimately led to it ended with Manny Diaz being the guy that comes to town, surprised a lot of people. And then he's showing up from Miami all of a sudden, bundling up, showing up to Beaver Stadium in early December. And here we are, year two. It's just really phenomenal stuff. And we'll have more coverage of that at Lions247.com. You can check out the entire video of this press conference from James Franklin on a Tuesday afternoon up at Lions247.com a bit later as well. Mark Brennan's working on that. He also had a lot of thoughts on what this bye week meant for Penn State from a recruiting perspective. We're going to jump into things from that angle with Tyler Calvaruso momentarily. He's got a lot to talk about with us on the recruiting subject. But there was also some thoughts on the non-conference scheduling, I guess, policy or approach of Penn State and really of everybody across college football right now is trying to find a way to get into that 12-team playoff moving beyond this year. And I mean, we just talked about it. 6 of the top 10 teams in that AP top 25 are going to be in this conference next year, Daniel. And let's go through this upcoming schedule. Before we talk about his non-conference stuff, you wrote about the upcoming 5-season span of Big Ten football. Now, who knows what gets blown up along the way? We've seen this Big Ten structure change several times in the last few years, but with the influx of former Pac-12 programs and really the Pac-12's best programs coming into the conference next year, what stood out to you about, let's start initially 2024 with that home and away opponents list?
Yeah, I think the one thing that jumped out to me is that there's going to be a lot of changes between now and next year from a personnel standpoint, just because of teams that are going to be graduating quarterbacks, but at the same time, with the portal, who knows, what exactly things look like. But even with guys like Caleb Williams and Michael Penix Jr., Talia Tungavailoa, probably moving on. I mean, my impression of this 2024 Penn State, opponents list is it's going to be tough in the Big Ten. Like, I know that you don't have the Ohio State and Michigan, matchups every year anymore. Penn State doesn't have any protected teams, so there's no one they're going to be playing every year, which I think is a little bit of an interesting wrinkle. But you look at it, and you've got Illinois, Maryland, Ohio State, UCLA, and Washington at home, Minnesota, Purdue, USC, and Wisconsin on the road. That USC game got flipped from being a home game to a road game next year. Washington is the new addition since they got added in August. That feels like forever ago. And then some of those road trips. I mean, we've heard about how weird West Lafayette can be, and we know that Wisconsin is a tough place to play. But looking at it, and the first impression being that this is going to be pretty tough. I mean, it's pretty much just what it's going to be every year now. Because you don't have to play Ohio State, Michigan State, every year anymore. But you're swapping, one or both or all of those out with a USC, a UCLA, an Oregon, a Washington, some combination of that. So, I think my first impression was that, I was like, okay, this is going to be pretty tough. My second impression is that the way that things are set up, I think the Big Ten appears to have found a good formula. At least for the non-West Coast schools. I mean, I saw some reporters putting together maps of where Seattle or where Washington and Oregon are going to have to travel over these next couple of years, and how many miles it's going to be, and it's a lot. Like it's going to be a burden for those schools. But you look at it for Penn State, they're going to have one West Coast road trip a year through the season, and I think that that's something that makes it manageable. I think for these schools, you look at it next year, they're going to USC, and then you cycle through, and then in 5 years they're going to USC again. So I think that stood out to me just from the logistics and planning standpoint. But I think one of my overall takeaways was that, I mean, when you have 18 teams in a conference, there's going to be a lot of variety just because of what you're pulling from. But I just thought that it's I think there's a couple of years where the home schedule doesn't necessarily have as many heavy hitters as you might like, but I just think from an overall variety standpoint, it's a good schedule. It's a good model. I think about how when the SEC did its original expansion, I believe in 2012, and they brought in Texas A&M and Missouri. There's teams would go like 8 years between playing each other, and so I think that the Big Ten prioritizing having these teams see each other, making sure they have a home and home within a 5-year time span. I think that is good for the product. It's good for, I think, the conference's brand to kind of foster these kinds of matchups and relationships between the schools. But it's kind of crazy to be like, okay, 2028, like you're telling us now, we'll see when we get there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always got to be forward thinking in college football. It's been an issue for some of college football for many years now, and we'll see what it looks like. But the Big Ten is in excellent shape right now, along with the SEC, as this tidal wave of change is preparing to reach the shores of college football, and a lot of programs are trying to find some kind of lifeboat to hop into. And if you're in the Big Ten and you're in the SEC, you're on the luxury cruise boat right now. And when it comes to that 2024 schedule, just to reiterate, Ohio State comes to Beaver Stadium. UCLA, that's a top 25 program right now. They come to Beaver Stadium. Washington's in the top 10 right now. They're here. That road, the road trip game, these 4 road trip games, USC obviously goes without saying, going out to Los Angeles is going to be an event. And that team, whether they're going to probably lose Caleb Williams. I don't think he's going to hold out because of the NFL draft or whatever that some people have kind of floated, but they're going to reload. Whether it's going to find somebody in the transfer market at quarterback to plug and play or whatever, that's going to be a problem matchup year by year by year, as long as Lincoln Riley is there and he's getting the resources he needs. And then that trip to Wisconsin, really curious to see what that coaching staff can do between now and 2024. They showed some signs of forward progress here in 2023. You've got them on the road last year. That was the season opener back in 2021. And we know Penn State had to fight tooth and nail to get out of town with the win over the Badgers that day. And those are two tricky Big Ten road trips next year. Minnesota, Purdue, both those teams in recent years, we've seen Penn State go on the road there and have fights. They didn't get out of Minneapolis with a win back in 2019. And I can tell you, first person perspective, it was a fantastic environment put on that day for Minnesota. Now, they're in a little bit of a rocky situation right now with where they're at as a program, but that could be tricky. And then Purdue, you got to give them credit for the environment they put up in week 1 last year, down to the wire kind of game. So that 2024 schedule, if Penn State gets through, they're going to have to really earn it. But I think going back to James Franklin's initial point here, Daniel, is would you rather see Penn State play an SEC school in September on the road or here in Beaver Stadium, and just so you can say, go prove yourself, go do it? Or would you rather play an SEC program on the road or in Beaver Stadium in December because it's a first round playoff game and you got through the regular season with 2 losses instead of picking up a potential 3rd loss out of your conference on the road at an SEC school in September? And so James Franklin referenced there are programs, without directly saying who, that are, buying out future non-conference games, because we just laid it out. There's going to be 4 or 5, maybe 6 top 25 teams on this 9-game conference schedule for Penn State. It's going to be all across the country now. It's hard to find the motivation to go say, hey, Florida, hey, Florida State, you want to play randomly in September? Want to set a home and home with us? Let's just test ourselves out and tire ourselves out. And James Franklin doesn't sound like he has any interest in going back to Auburn.
Yeah, and that's something that he said at Auburn last year. I think someone asked him, about how open he would be to doing that again, and I think his answer is just like no, like we're good here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the flip side to this expansion. I just talked about getting a lot of variety within the conference, and you're not really getting that out of conference now because of teams trying to without a preseason, you're trying to get through September, healthy. You're trying to figure some things out, and it's hard to do that, against an Alabama or another team of that ilk. So I think that that's something that we've kind of put the pieces together when you look at Penn State's future schedules and the future deals that have been announced. The types of schools that they're going to be playing. I mean, there's a heavy dose of MAC in there. I think next year there's 2 MAC games. And then you look at some of the other more regional schools that Penn State is going to play in the future. I know that there's Temple is on a future schedule, Syracuse is on future schedules, and I think that that's just what this is. This is just what college football is right now, and I think it's you kind of do have to keep that payoff in mind, like you said. Would you rather play a team from the SEC or ACC in September, or would you rather have it in December with higher stakes and potentially a run to a championship on the line? So I think that, like we said, college football is constantly changing, and where things are cyclically, this is where it's pointing. Maybe the fact that the barrier to entry is lower now in terms of a 12-team playoff today I think James Franklin, said that they get in the 14 playoff, it's undefeated or one loss.
Yeah.
And like that is, the margin for error is so slim. But maybe with more of wiggle room, does that potentially down the road lead to more, games in September because that you could potentially drop one and still have the way through. But at the same time, like you said, these conference schedules are going to, be tough and, have some potentially big games and opportunities to trip up there too. So, I think that this is just kind of where things are, right now. And after West Virginia next year, it's kind of like, where do you go next in terms of a marquee non-con game? But it is
Simple.
kind
You go to
of
Philly.
yeah. I mean, you got to exercise some demons at the link, and then you kind of just go from there.
Yeah, a lot to work through with that upcoming schedule, but I mean, you're going to get a lot of interesting opponents coming through here to Happy Valley: Oregon, Washington, UCLA, USC, and as we said, because of the playoffs, you could get anybody in Power 5 or beyond, considering what's going on with that 12-team expansion. And let's finish off with some basketball notes here before we bring in Tyler Calvaruso for a recruiting update, Daniel, because starting to get a little peek at this Penn State hoop squad. You got Big Ten Media Days cooking. We're in the thick of it with Penn State football season, but we want to take a little bit of time. You've got some coverage at Lions247.com. Let's start with Mike Rhodes, who you heard from earlier on a Tuesday. You've got a story up. What are you making of his progress here in year one on campus?
Yeah, Mike Rhodes is out at Big Ten Media Days in Minneapolis right now, and on Tuesday morning he had his news conference, and I think that I didn't realize he's the only new coach in the Big Ten this year. So
Wow.
I think there's a little bit of extra interest in him. And especially, Penn State really was one of the, most interesting or even best stories in college basketball last year, not just for the Big Ten, but nationally, with guys like Jalen Pickett, what Micah Shrewsbury did. So, I think that there's a lot of eyeballs on them. And then you see, adding 10 players in 59 days, through the transfer portal plus a freshman. I think that a lot of people are really curious about Mike Rhodes and the job he did. He fielded a couple questions about the transfer portal Tuesday morning, and then was kind of just asked about, putting it together. And that's what I focused on in writing about today. And he talked a lot about trust, and he talked a lot about belief. He shouted out Pat Kraft and Neely Bendapudi in terms of alignment within the athletic department and the university. And he also acknowledged that that this is gonna be really hard. The Big Ten is a premier basketball league. I had to do a top 10, or not top 10. I had to do my top 14. Rank the teams 1 to 14 for a preseason poll that our 24/7 Sports colleague Isaac Trotter put together in just a massive preview package today. And it gets to the point where you're in that like 7 to 12 range, and you do not know where to put teams, how to order them, everything like that. And you look at it and you've got Michigan and Iowa down there near the bottom 4, and you're like, wait, these programs aren't like this. So it's going to be a grind, but I think that Penn State has players, and I think there's excitement about them right now.
You mentioned the players. There's a lot of new names, new faces, trying to figure it out. This may have been a Nittany Lions team that finally broke through, went to the NCAA tournament, but it's not like they bring back a bunch of those dudes. There's a couple of them in year two that's decided to stick around through everything. What did you pick up? I know you're still kind of working your way through what the players actually put out there in their discussions in Indianapolis, but from your early feedback, what kind of stands out? And what do you think generally about where this roster can get before that opening tip?
Penn State took Puff Johnson, Kanye Clary, and Ace Baldwin to Minneapolis this week. Kanye Clary is one of only 3 guys who's returning from last year's team. And of those 3 players, Jameel Brown and Demetrius Lilly are the other 2. Kanye Clary played the most. He was in the rotation for that stretch run. And I thought it was and it's the thing we talk about with James Franklin. Like, you look at who they take to events like this, who they're putting out there, and I think it says something about Kanye Clary that he's only a sophomore, and he's getting put, he's getting put in the spotlight like this. He was on Big Ten Network with Ace Baldwin and Mike Rhodes, and he talked about, how last year the experience was so valuable for him. To be able to play with Jalen Pickett, Seth Lundy, Andrew Funk, play in the NCAA tournament, and now come back, and it's allowed him to be in a bigger role. He's going to get the opportunity to learn from Ace Baldwin, who was the A10 Player of the Year and the A10 Defensive Player of the Year, playing for Rhodes at VCU last year. So I think that Kanye Clary is someone who coming into this year is going to be very interesting to watch, and it could really wind up to be a really key player for Penn State.
I know our 24/7 Sports recruiting team were really high on Clary when he was coming out of high school in terms of his potential to be a tone-setting type of point guard, a program leader type. Bringing in a guy like Ace Baldwin, you don't necessarily need to rush him into that type of role, but retaining him was huge. There's no doubt about that. Daniel and Mark Brennan will be all over the Penn State basketball beat when the time comes, but look for some coverage here coming out of Big Ten Media Days from Daniel over at Lions247.com. Daniel, myself, and Mark will be back at Penn State practice on Wednesday. We'll get another look at the team. We'll get another chance to hear from James Franklin and a few different players. Be sure to check out all of our VIP coverage for the rest of this week. We also have Coach Jaywan Sider, running backs coach, a little bit later in the week. Good chance to pick his brain on what's going on with Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, and the rest of that bunch. Daniel, great stuff as always. Appreciate you hopping on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tyler.
All right, let's shift gears over to Tyler Calvaruso, because when James Franklin said that the bye week is not an off week, well, you could look at the recruiting efforts as the primary case in point there. And Tyler, you were all over that along the way. We're now back into a game week, so there's another game list brewing for visitors coming to see Penn State in action against UMass. First and foremost, though, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back on. And it definitely was not a week off. Staff was a lot of different places. There was a lot of activity on the recruiting trail as usual.
Yeah, James Franklin referenced that actually today, and he gave us a little bit of his itinerary, which we don't often hear, but it's discussing the importance of recruiting during the bye week and where he was, guys being sent all over the place. He said he was personally at Connecticut, North Carolina, Florida, New Jersey, Massachusetts, then got back to campus for a Sunday practice, of course. And he's got a lot of trust right now. He talked about the ability for Penn State to expand its support staff in a lot of different ways. It kind of frees up some of these position coaches to really invest in recruiting this week, and they want to take advantage of that. He was standing alongside Jaywan Sider last Thursday night at one of the premier prep games down in the state of Florida. So making the rounds, what stood out to you, James Franklin specifically, about what he was able to get out and do?
I think he was able to accomplish a lot with really a bevy of prospects, ranging from 2024s who are on the board and, guys who may be committed to other programs right now, checking in with the commits. When he was up in New England, when he got the chance to stop by Cheshire, check in on Luke Reynolds. He was really, Franklin and the entire staff got the opportunity to check on their 2024 commits, and that was something that they always like to accomplish during the bye week. And then with the 2025s, Franklin and multiple members of the staff were really all over the nation, trying to, get out there, get some face time with guys, show faces at games. That's what the staff was able to accomplish, especially regionally. Franklin, like you just detailed, his itinerary, multiple assistants were active in the area. Jaywan Sider was working Florida, as he always does, like you just mentioned. He was out there at a game on Thursday night, stayed down there Friday, did a lot of work there. Terry Smith was flying coast to coast, getting work in. Anthony Poindexter was in the DMV checking in with some safety targets. And really, man, just staff was everywhere. You got to give them credit. Bye week is always a busy time between the practicing and then the recruiting at the end of the week. The staff was able to accomplish a lot getting out, mainly Thursday and Friday. That was when the staff was on the road the most. And they were in a lot of places. And I think that all the feedback that we've received has been pretty positive. And I think Penn State accomplished exactly what it wanted to accomplish during the bye week. And the bye week recruiting, when these guys are out on the road, it's always sort of a building block kind of setting. You want to further relationships, not just with, prospects and the fact that those prospects are appreciative of these coaches making it to their schools and checking up on them. You want to further the relationships with the high school coaches as well. Because while Penn State did return to a lot of familiar places to recruit during the bye week, some of these schools maybe are not necessarily part of the traditional footprint. And even regionally, sometimes Penn State just doesn't recruit certain high schools as often as they do other schools just because of the talent at those respective programs. So it's not just about furthering the relationships with the players and the prospects being recruited. It's about, getting to know these high school coaches a little bit better and getting them more comfortable with the personalities that Penn State. So I think Penn State was able to accomplish a lot in that regard this past week.
You better believe a high school coach and his staff and everybody in that area, they're going to remember that a coach took the time during a bye week to show up. And another thing It's a lot better to be able to hit this bye week and go tout your program when you're 5-0 and ranked number 6 nationally versus coming off a loss where you show up and people are, maybe asking you some questions about what's going wrong, picking your brain. You can ride a lot of momentum into these high school hallways right now when you're a Penn State football coach or onto these sidelines right now. And so I know you covered a lot of that in detail for our Lions247 subscribers, which, by the way, if you're not on board with us, $1 for 1 month to take a test run, 30% off annual VIP membership, has you covered all year long with football, basketball, recruiting, and of course the transfer portal when that pops up. But getting back to your coverage, I know you have more detailed reports on what some of these coaches were doing, who they were seeing, why they were seeing them. But we had another name pop up along the way here late in the bye week into the weekend for the 2024 cycle, not from the high school ranks, but from the junior college level that caught our attention. Talk us through the late stages of that recruitment and what actually went down at the finish line.
Yeah, we had to circle back on Sione Lalea during the stretch run of his recruitment. When he released the public top 3 of Miami, Oregon, and USC, Penn State never really let up. Behind the scenes, they were still very much involved. Terry Smith was working that pretty hard because that relationship between Smith and Lalea, by Lalea's own admission, was one of the better ones in his recruitment. And really, at the end of the day, this one just came down to things not working out for Penn State when it came to landing Lalea. Things just didn't align. And it's a blow because Lalea was definitely wanted in the class for a multitude of reasons. Obviously, a very talented prospect, top-ranked junior college prospect in the nation, as a matter of fact, on the 247 Sports Composite. I believe we have him ranked as a number 4 JUCO talent in the nation, but the consensus number 1 junior college cornerback. And you've seen Penn State have some success recruiting the junior college rank, mostly locally at Lackawanna, but there's been a lot of success bringing in some JUCO DBs. Tig Brown being the most recent. There was hope Lalea could be another one of those guys, and granted, him having a couple of years of experience under his belt, he would have been able to come in right away and compete for playing time. So there's some disappointment that this one was not able to come together. And, we've documented what exactly happened there for our Lions247 subscribers. It was a sensitive situation down the stretch, and I think Penn State did all it could to get Lalea on board. Didn't work out in the end. And now at this point in the cycle, Penn State is very pleased with the 5 defensive backs that it has on board in its 2024 class. So Terry Smith and Anthony Poindexter really going to be keeping an eye out for, the late risers. Maybe something pops up on the flip front moving forward. That's something we're always going to have to monitor approaching the early signing period in December. But right now, it's kind of back to the drawing board, seeing what pops up from here on out with Lalea off to Oregon.
Yeah, Lalea, the number 1 JUCO prospect in the composite rankings. 247 Sports has him at number 4 overall among junior college talent in the class of 2024 from the College of San Mateo. We know what Penn State has done in the past with some of those junior college standouts in the defensive backfield, turning out some really good ones in Jair Brown and Jaquan Brisker. But when we assess this 2024 class, because that was a significant name, and it was one that we kind of had moved on from, and then all of a sudden we were right back on that name for a little while. But now that Sione Lalea, and I guess that may be the last time I have to butcher his name on the podcast, now that chapter is over, look, 24 commits, the number 12 class overall. Let's start on defense because we're addressing a defensive situation. Where are they? What needs to be done? And who are the names that we all need to know here on October 10th, which puts us about 2 months and 2 weeks ahead of that early signing period just before Christmas?
Yeah, it's getting here quickly. And before anything else, just regarding overall class size, because that is obviously important with 24 recruits already on board, still hearing that 27, 29 range we kind of discussed during the summer. And, for a little bit, it looked like it might not reach that point, but Penn State has been working the flip front pretty hard. So I think there is definitely the chance for multiple additions on both sides of the ball moving forward. Defensively, Jalen Harvey remains the name that is drawing the most attention right now. He is still uncommitted early in October. And he told Brian Doan last month that he is indeed looking to wrap things up this month. Will that happen? We've had a couple of previous dates with Jalen Harvey where it looked like he was going to wrap things up and it didn't happen. So I think he's getting, down to it right now. I think he's getting to the nitty-gritty of where he wants to go. Penn State is still very much on his radar. USC's pushed really hard late in the process. And, you got in-state Maryland still circling as well. Again, I keep on saying it. I really just think it comes down to, I have the belief that Penn State still has enough in the tank to get things done with Jalen Harvey. That's why my crystal ball prediction for him to land with the Nittany Lions, which has been in place. We're coming up on a year. I believe I placed that prediction last October 22nd or something like that. And it's the 10th here today. So we're coming up on a year of having that crystal ball pick in. And I'm still feeling pretty decent about it. It's definitely the complexion of the recruitment. It's definitely changed since that pick went in. That prediction was placed at a time where Jalen Harvey had visited Penn State, I believe, 3 times in the span of a month. It might have been 4 times in the span of 2 months. I'd have to go back and look at that, but he was a very frequent visitor to campus. And at that point, it kind of felt like, hey, look, he's coming around this often. When's this one going to end? And here we are in 2023, and it's still going on. But I think Jalen's getting closer. At least that's what he told Doan. So that's kind of what we have to roll with, and we'll provide any updates as we have them. And then beyond Harvey, I know we talk about him a bunch, but there are still other names defensively in 2024 to know. Ernest Willer, speaking of Doan, he got the chance to catch up with him today. Penn State still a program very much involved there. We've talked about it. Nittany Lions, an official visit in December, very much in play. That still remains the case. So we're going to have to see what Willer decides. No
official visits to this point.
Not yet.
This is very rare. Top 100 prospect, Ernest Willer, a pretty coveted defensive lineman here. No official visits. We're in October. We're talking about really down to the wire scenario that you just don't see play out very often with the modern calendar.
No, it's definitely, it's kind of an old school recruitment in that regard, right?
Yeah.
Where things would be a little bit late developing with top ranked players. Willer, that's the case for him. He wasn't active during the spring, as we've talked about a bunch. He's kind of get things going now, and he's on his own timeline, but he is still definitely wanted by a bunch of top tier programs, Penn State among them. Moving past the defensive line, linebacker, it's not an overwhelming priority with Anthony Speckett and Kari Jackson on board, but there's still, some conversations being had. Elijah Newby, the USC commit, Penn State would like to get him back on campus. Never got the chance to host him in June. He popped for the Trojans. It caught a lot of people inside of Lash off guard. So that's something they're still working. Will he make it back? We're just going to have to see. We already touched on the secondary. And actually, circling back to the defensive line real quick, they're working the flip front there as well. There have been conversations with Florida commit Morris Williams. There have been conversations with David Polipala, the in-state USC commit. I don't think anything's really going to happen there, but it is something that has continued. There have been conversations with LJ McCray, who is a very, very good defensive line prospect down at Daytona Beach, Mainland High in Florida. He's announcing soon, though. I don't think that one is going to go Penn State's way. So, a lot of recruitments where Penn State's working, but it's kind of tough to say where exactly they stand right now. Sometimes that's the case in October. You still got a couple of months to change the minds of these kids.
You mentioned Elijah Newby, the top 24/7 linebacker prospect out of Cheshire Academy up in Connecticut. He is a teammate with Luke Reynolds, and as you mentioned, Penn State staff had a presence up there to check in on the top 100 tight end prospects. So we'll see if Newby and maybe with some help from Luke Reynolds ends up circling back and getting to campus. But USC commitment, obviously, you can respect that one. But it's across the country incoming Big Ten football program. Really curious to see how much the Trojans start to pop up in some battles with Penn State in this region in the coming years. Tyler, let's go to the offensive side of things. I just mentioned Luke Reynolds. He's one of the headliners for this class. They've got 3 receivers on board, a couple running backs. They've got the quarterback who's rising up the rankings. They've got a big offensive line class, both figuratively and literally. What am I missing, and what is maybe Penn State still missing?
Well, we got to start at what happened at wide receiver over the weekend. We talked about Nye Carr's potential official visit to Penn State. And, as we speculated a little bit when we discussed him late in the week, would he make it through the weekend without committing to Miami while on his official visit in Coral Gables? And he wound up popping for the Hurricanes, coming off a pretty tough loss, but still enough for Miami.
Pretty tough. Hold on. Pretty tough loss.
I mean,
the fact that they didn't get anybody to commit after that is a remarkable. And then the fact that it actually impacts us here on the conversation is even more impressive. I actually did miss that. I think I was too fixated on the on-field finish for Miami. But wow, that was a pretty bad loss.
I don't even know how you sum that one up, man. You're a Miami player right now. Jeez. But so that's a wide receiver name off the board for Penn State. Another one where, Marcus Hagens worked really hard to get Penn State involved late. This one didn't go Penn State's way, but Hagens is going to keep trying with a bunch of guys. One of the stops that he made during the bye week was at Winslow Township High in South Jersey, and that just so happens to be home to Jalen Hornsby. So he's a name you have to keep an eye on. Nick Marsh, the Michigan State commit, remains a name to keep an eye on, although I'm trending towards thinking that's not going to happen for Penn State. Right now, the one I'm watching the closest is probably Cam Coleman, Texas A&M commit. Penn State would like to get him back to campus or on campus for a visit close to the early signing period. Again, we're going to have to see if that one comes together. it's still a couple months before getting to that point. But Penn State really likes him. Higgins has done a good job there, keeping the Nittany Lions involved. So there are a bunch of names that in play at wide receiver. Tight end, Penn State took its big shots during the summer, but they're done there. Running back, same kind of deal. They're comfortable with Quentin Martin and Corey Smith. Quarterback, I mean, what more can you say about Ethan Grunkemeyer at this point and what he's been able to accomplish? Nittany Lions really happy with what they have there. On the offensive line, still some activity. Still some conversations with Wisconsin commit Kevin Haywood, who never got the chance to officially visit during June. And, I don't know if that's going to happen during the fall, but it's remained something that continues to pop up. So I think one more possible addition on the offensive line, specifically at tackle, if possible, is something that this Penn State staff would desire at this point in the cycle.
Something that caught my ear there, you said Cam Coleman, just a name to know at that wide receiver spot as they assess things. Is that accurate, the Texas A&M commitment?
Yes.
I mean, he's a 5-star in 24/7 Sports Assessment. He's out of the state of Alabama, where, of course, Harrison Wallace was once a star, currently in this wide receiver room. You got Dakari Nelson, who was one of the premier defensive prospects out of the state of Alabama, signing with the Nittany Lions in the last class. So, sorry, that just caught my attention because I had to double check, because when we're talking about a 5-star caliber,
he's a good player,
SEC
man.
territory, committed to an SEC program, and that's something that and Penn State should be shooting its shot right now, right? I mean, in this moment in time, they should absolutely be trying to do that. In terms of getting guys on campus, that noon kickoff against Michigan doesn't do you any favors, especially if you're kind of trying to go outside of the region. Brian Doan did say on this podcast he felt like that event, if Penn State gets there unbeaten, is going to be a bigger recruiting event than what we saw take place for the whiteout this year when Iowa came to town. And if you recall from Tyler and Brian's coverage that week, it was a damn big recruiting event. But you just wonder if it's not the December official visits, are you sneaking guys here for some of these later Big Ten games? How does the staff want to play that? But wide receiver, we'll keep tabs there. Any general thoughts on the 2024 class that you haven't mentioned yet before we move on to some other things later down the road?
Well, regarding what I haven't mentioned yet, one name I forgot on the offensive line, it's the name to know right now, is A.J. Dennis, the Michigan State commit. An official visit to Penn State is still very much in play for him. So that's something to monitor moving forward. I have an idea of what his plans are. Really not going to go into detail on it right now, but I'd expect some news on that front relatively soon. And the current makeup of this 2024 class, it is what it is. We've talked about it a bunch. It's a top tier group. I think there's a lot of talent that Penn State is excited about on both sides of the ball, especially that wide receiver room. It might not be, besides Josiah Brown, who's a top 24/7 prospect, or he might arguably be the most raw prospect in that class, in that wide receiver hall. It's a good group, and Penn State feels good about a lot of the guys it's had, even potentially them outplaying their rankings when it's all said and done. So I think there's a comfort with what Penn State has been able to accomplish so far this cycle, but there's still that burning desire to continue adding in the class, and that's why this Penn State staff is working the flip front as hard as it is. And you saw it last cycle, landing Kavion Keys away from North Carolina late. I think Penn State has enough juice to make another kind of move like that happen.
And Andrew Dennis, who you just mentioned, Michigan State commit, and we'll see what happens. That Spartans class is obviously in a precarious spot right now with what's happening in East Lansing, but he is considered a top 24/7 offensive lineman, top 200, in fact, right now. So if Tyler has more on Dennis and what it might mean for Penn State, our VIP subscribers can check that out at Lions247.com as things get sorted out there. Let's go to look at an upcoming visit a little bit down the road. We'll talk about maybe who's coming for the UMass matchup, and as you might imagine, not really carrying quite as much juice as some of the other home games this season. But down the road, Michigan, a confirmed visitor coming through here on a Tuesday, and a significant one for Mike Yurcich.
Yeah, Ryan Montgomery, top 24/7 quarterback out of Findlay High. Yurcich was there during the bye week, got to check in on him. That came after watching him throw during the spring. And Montgomery has long been one of Penn State's priority 2025 quarterback targets. He hasn't been on campus for a while. So getting him back for this visit, given the fact that the Nittany Lions are in his top 5, pretty important, I would say. I think Montgomery and his family, I think they're giving Penn State a legitimate look right now. Florida has seemingly done well with Montgomery. I think he's still pretty open. I don't think he's close to really winding down yet. I think he's still exploring all of his options. And Penn State is one that is right in the thick of things. So he'll be in town for the Michigan game, and he's going to have the opportunity to see a high-level football game, 2 high-level offenses. So that'll have to be pretty appealing for him. But that's a big visit for Penn State coming together down the road.
He's a top 24/7 four-star prospect out of Findlay, Ohio. His older brother, Luke Montgomery, was one of the premier offensive linemen in the 2023 class, signed with Ohio State there in the home state. Montgomery has a national recruitment going on, and Mike Yurcich just keeps popping up within this recruitment, and now he's going to repay the favor, get back here to campus, as you reported at Lions247 today. Tyler, let's look at a few more items here. As I said, UMass coming to town. It's a 42-point spread, but it's still a home game. And you've only got 7 of these matchups per year. You want to maximize them when you can. 3:30 kickoff probably does you some favors in terms of maybe getting guys to campus later on a Saturday versus a noon kickoff. What do you make of what the list is thus far early on in the week for guests? And who are some names that you think are worth sharing here on the podcast?
Right now, the majority of the confirmations we received are underclassmen. 2 notable 2026 names to discuss. Elias Koch from Harrisburg. He's planning on attending. He was going to be on campus for the Delaware game last month, but I don't know if our listeners remember, there was that was a pretty crappy weather weekend, and it altered the high school football schedule in the Northeast. Harrisburg had a game on Friday night that got pushed to Saturday. That scrapped the ability for Koch to make a visit, but he's circling back, and he's going to be in town this upcoming weekend. Damari Clemens, the New York native, Buffalo native, he's down playing his high school ball at Grayson in Loganville, Georgia now. He's going to be heading back up to the Northeast for a visit. He was last on campus to camp for the staff during June, and he picked up his offer. It was during the winter. He followed that up with a visit during the spring. Really likes the Penn State staff. Have to see where things are going early in that recruitment, but he's got some solid offers early in his process. And beyond the underclassmen, Michigan State 2024 commit in the secondary, Justin Denson, he's going to be on campus as well. He publicized that yesterday.
I wanted to address quickly another name in that 2025 class that you were able to catch up with, someone that I thought really impressed at Penn State camp this summer. We've talked a lot about Anthony Poindexter recruiting safeties who kind of look like him in each class. It feels like he's that long-limbed All-American safety down at the University of Virginia before he went off to the NFL. And he's got height. He's got length in that room. Dakari Nelson, we're all going to be monitoring him. They got more of it coming in the 2024 class. And when we look over at 2025, while Kanoa Winston has been the name that we keep hammering, I feel like, at that position, KJ Winston's younger cousin. Another name to know out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina is Jaden Blair. 6'4", 180 pounds. I don't know if that 6'4" is totally legit, but I know he's pretty close based on what we saw in front of us on the field this summer. Where does Penn State stand with him? He's a composite 4-star prospect, and Anthony Poindexter, I think you're starting to get to the point as a Nittany Lions fan or follower where you say you're putting your trust in what this guy's going to do at that position cycle by cycle.
I think Blair, I'd have to go back and look. I think he's more 6'2", 6'3", but his length it's something that stands out about him. We got to see him in a camp setting in June, and he was really impressive. And he was banged up at that Penn State camp and was still one of the best players in attendance that day. So I think that speaks to the level of talent. Penn State has done a really, really good job with Blair. It's gotten him on campus multiple times. He has felt more and more comfortable each time he makes it to town. And he told me that after the staff dropped in on him at Mount Tabor High in Winston-Salem in North Carolina during the bye week, he is planning on taking an official visit to Penn State. It's possible that he makes it back to campus again this fall for a game visit. He's working to see if he can make that happen. But even if he doesn't, he knows that Penn State is going to receive one of his official visits. And I think the Nittany Lions, it's interesting because Penn State and Notre Dame are both involved with Blair, and both are top contenders for Blair. That's also the case with Brunswick School prospect Ethan Long, and Penn State checked in on him during the bye week as well. When it comes to those two recruitments, I think Notre Dame has the edge for Long right now, and when it comes to Blair, I think it's kind of flipped around where Penn State has the edge. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic playing out in the 2025 cycle. Those safety prospects, both high on the board for Penn State. And I think that right now with Blair, things are trending about, I'd say, as well as they could be. If he makes it back again this fall, that'd be pretty interesting. But either way, that official visit is very much in the plans for the North Carolina native. And it's not just him feeling comfortable to Penn State staff. It's the family as well. You know, there are some connections between Blair's father, Jay, who played in the NFL for a little bit, and Alan Zalmitis. Those two are pretty close. So that has worked in Penn State's favor. And there's just a lot going there for the Nittany Lions right now.
I want to punctuate this podcast episode by spotlighting, kind of the detailed work and your approach to what we do at Lions247.com. And you had a story up on Logan Bond, who was a preferred walk-on addition to Penn State's 2024 plans. Big 6'5", 290-plus-pound offensive lineman out of Ramsey, New Jersey. Had several opportunities and offers at the FCS level, as you noted in your story. Bucknell, Colgate, Cornell, Georgetown, Maine, Merrimack among them. He will instead try to earn an opportunity at Penn State without a scholarship. And one thing that has stood out to me, Tyler, and I know you've covered the team far less, but since I got here to campus in 2017, is just generally when you observe an entire roster, from the Saquon Barkley down to your very last offensive lineman who's a walk-on. What is that gathering of humans look like on the football field? And year by year, it's been more physically impressive. And they've really, I feel like, done a better job of bringing in the kind of talent who has FCS offers on the table. Tell us a little bit more about Logan Bond. And by the way, we've seen a walk-on addition contribute to this team, and I believe 4 games thus far. And I think Ian Harvey getting out there, Dominic Ruley getting out there involved as a redshirt freshman as a third-string center. We've seen him out there for 4 games. So these walk-on linemen could factor in earlier than you might even imagine.
Yeah, and it's rare that I have people reach out to me with feedback on a preferred walk-on. Usually the commitment kind of just happens, then we get eyes on him. At some point, we make our own determination. But I had multiple people reach out to me about Logan Bond. There are plenty of people who think this kid could play and feel that, again, it's preferred walk-on, but Penn State kind of feels like he got a little bit of a steal here because there's a lot of confidence in this kid's ability. Impressive FCS offer list. He is around 6'4", 280 as an interior lineman. So Penn State likes the size. And Phil Trotwin's not bringing guys in who he thinks cannot compete at the Big Ten level, whether you're on scholarship or a preferred walk-on. And Bond, I think he's going to have the opportunity to develop under Trout's watch. I think that right now, he's still developing. Probably needs to get a little bit in the strength and conditioning program with Chuck Losey. But if you turn on his tape for a little bit, you can see he plays with the kind of nestedness you want to see out of interior offensive lineman at any level. He already has that in him. That's not something that needs to be coached. So Penn State already has a head start in that regard. And if he becomes a depth piece at some point in his career, or a depth piece that could be relied upon at much, I think that's a pretty big win for Penn State. It's like you said, from top to bottom, roster-wise, you want to have guys who can play, because if there's a rash of injuries, and especially on the offensive line, and the defensive line too, it always pops up. Guys go down. You need guys being ready to step up and take on increased roles. You want the top of your roster to look good. You want the bottom of your roster to look good as well. Guy like Bond, being able to add him as a preferred walk-on, it just really raises the ceiling of your team, in my opinion. When you have a preferred walk-on player who you trust that much, if he could get to that point, this would be a pretty big win for Penn State if Bond reaches that point in his development. But there's a lot of excitement about this get. And like I said, that really doesn't happen a whole lot with preferred walk-on. So I think this is definitely something to kind of store in the back of the mind as he goes throughout his Penn State career. Who knows what could happen?
I think we've noticed this a few times in our practice reports over the last couple of years, but that offensive line group, when we look at like the D squad guys, the scout team players, there's more Power 5 bodies. I don't know if they're necessarily Power 5 athletes out there, but Power 5 type bodies who look that part and are going to give your lead defensive linemen and your lead defensive players a legitimate look out there over the course of the week. There's more of those guys available than there were 6-7 years ago. I mean, I think that's a very obvious just takeaway from covering this team. And Logan Bond kind of fits what they're looking for. Also offering some position versatility, maybe a perimeter, maybe an interior kind of player that you need to be that type of player if you're going to earn a roster spot. So something to track, as you said. I just wanted to make sure we mentioned that because it's not just always about star chasing and find out what 4 stars and 5 stars are looking at your program. It's about building that comprehensive roster from the very top of it to the bottom of it and making sure you're as buttoned up as possible to pursue Big Ten championships and beyond. Tyler Calvaruso, anything we didn't hit on this episode, anything you want to make sure that people are aware of? I know we don't get you out on this podcast enough during the season because we have so much other things to talk about game by game. But so the moment is yours if you want to make sure that people are paying close attention.
So I think we touched on everything I wanted to cover today. But before we wrap here, I do want to give a shout out to Stanford commit Benedict Dume, who was on the Penn State board for a really long time. He took an official visit, and the Nittany Lions, he was a priority prospect for them. He, unfortunately fell ill. He recently wrapped up chemotherapy. He posted that on Twitter, and really great kid. So that's awesome to see that he's going to be starting the road to recovery, getting back healthy, getting back on the field at some point. So just wanted to give him a quick shout out. He's putting a lot of work over these past 12 weeks to get himself right. He posted on Twitter that he's all good to go. So really love seeing that.
I saw that too. What a way to finish the podcast. Really a great note there, Tyler, and congratulations to Benedict. Hopefully he moves forward and it's just a part of his past now. But great stuff. Tyler, thanks for the lowdown on Penn State recruiting. We know we'll find a lot more of it at Lions247.com in the days, weeks, months to come.
Yep. Thanks for having me, man.
All right, great stuff from Tyler Calvaruso. And before him, Daniel Gallen breaking down the latest from Beaver Stadium press conference with James Franklin, which you can catch in its entirety over at Lions247.com. We'll be back on the practice field Wednesday. We'll be back with you on Thursday with another edition of this podcast. You'll hear a lot more about the matchup this week between UMass and Penn State. Learn more about the Minutemen, who, as we referenced, struggling thus far at 1-6 on the season. And we'll also focus in on what we heard and what we saw on the practice field and what that might mean for this matchup coming our way on Saturday, homecoming for the number 6 Nittany Lions. For now, stepping aside, I am Tyler Donahue. Thanks as always for listening or watching the Lions 24/7 podcast.